Well, hello there. I've got notes. Well, I was wrong about climate change. Let's talk about those silly scientists who happen to be climate deniers. And if you don't believe in climate change, then you're a silly flat earther. Or whatever insult the lefties might throw at you. I'll put the name of the scientists that I'm going to talk about in the description so you can go and visit their various websites and YouTube pages and have a good look. But this Professor Ian Plimer, he states that our planet, this Professor Ian Plimer states that our planet's climate is governed by cycles, and often cycles within cycles. Every 100,000 years, the Earth's orbit around the Sun changes from circular to elliptical. And approximately 143,000 years ago, the axis of our planet changes. And every 20,000 years, our axis wobbles. The Sun also has cycles. It has cycles of solar maxima and minima. And that happens every 10,000 years. But how stupid, of course, that these scientists claim that the Sun is the biggest driver of climate change on Earth. However, the oceans also have 60-year cycles, that they push warm water up into the Arctic. The Chinese even had calendars based on this 60-year cycle. The last glaciation was between 128,000 and 116,000 years ago, meaning that at that time the Earth was encased in ice and up to 40 metres of ice at the equator. Good Morning Britain the other day claimed that the Mediterranean was the hottest on record for the last 125,000 years, which Good Morning Britain were absolutely spot on there, because it was warmer than 125,000 years ago, because the Earth was a giant snowball. Also at that time, sea levels were 130 metres lower than they are today. Now, I'll get back to that in a minute. Some 70,000 years ago, a massive earthquake spewed hot volcanic ash into the atmosphere, and it circled the planet. Now, this destroyed and devastated all the plant life on the equator. So the natives had to go elsewhere to find food. Now, because the seawater level was 130 metres lower than it is today, these natives were able to walk across to other continents in search of food. Yeah, that's how the rest of Europe and the southern parts of these places were populated. Anyway, I'll digress slightly. Yeah, so when you hear these climate alarmists talking about millimetres of water change, water increase with the tide will come up, that's nothing really compared to the 130 metres. The 130 metres that we had during the last ice age. Getting back to the ice on the land, because there was so much ice on the land, the land started to sink into the magma, into the Earth's crust. And now that the ice has gone, change pages. Now that the ice has gone, the land has started to come back out of the magma, started to rise up again. A bit like how a boat bobs when you step ashore. As for temperature changes, well, there hasn't really been any temperature changes for the last 40 years. Okay, there might have been a small increase, say 0.06 of a degree. But when you go back 150 years ago, you'll find out that there was 3 warming and cooling phases. If you go back to the Roman times, you'll find that we are 5 degrees cooler than the warmest period in Roman times. If you go back to 1850, it was so cold that we were holding barbecues on the ice on the River Thames. And to be honest, we are still warming up since that mini ice age. Now, changing scientists, let's go on to Patrick Moore, what he states. Now, Patrick Moore, he is the founder of Greenpeace. Now, he left when Greenpeace was taken over by these money-greedy lefties. Now, he goes on to say that David Attenborough has lied to us about polar bears, and he's lied to us about baby albatrosses. It's very easy to convince us of something that we can't see for ourselves. It's not very easy for us to go to the poles and have a look at the polar bears, or to go to the Atlantic Ocean to see the albatrosses. But sea ice does melt during the summer, and sea ice reforms during the winter. And during the summer months, the polar bears hunt on land. Polar bears are actually doing very well for themselves at the moment. So well, in fact, that the governments have lifted the ban on hunting polar bears. Now, we've all seen the photograph of the baby albatrosses with their stomachs exploded, filled with plastics. Well, that photograph was faked, according to this Patrick Moore. Yes, they do feed their chicks hard things, like small pieces of hard plastic, pieces of driftwood, pieces of pumice stone that might have come from volcanic eruptions. Also, the beak from squid goes into their gizzards. In the same way that land birds feed pebbles to chicks so that they can grind up the food in their gizzards because they haven't got teeth. So what caused the death of that baby albatross, we don't know. But to assume that albatrosses feed their chicks plastic bags is pure fiction. Now, personally, I've said that there is plastic in our food. Well, we wrap our food in plastics. Plastics are not toxic. Plastics in our food is just unsightly, but it's not toxic. So I do apologise if I gave anyone some fright about plastics in our food, but it's not poisonous. Changing the page again. Now, Dr. John Christy, now he studied climate all his life, and Dr. John Christy states that there is zero evidence to suggest that CO2 is driving global warming. In fact, the opposite is true. We have evidence to suggest via these temperature versus CO2 charts that as the temperature starts to increase, after a short delay, CO2 levels start to increase. It's not the other way around. Temperature goes up, CO2 goes up. This is because as the water warms, it releases its CO2. Cold water can hold quite a lot of CO2 gas. And when you go back a few million years ago, the sea creatures decided it would be a good idea to build calcium carbonate skeletons. Now, these skeletons were laid down over millions of years, and parts of Dover show this in the fossil record. That's right, the White Cliffs of Dover are made up from calcium carbonate deposits from the skeletons of the sea creatures. Now, if you go back 20 years ago, CO2 levels have risen by 11% to a massive 0.0416%, or 416 parts per million. But go back a million years ago, and CO2 levels were around about 4,000 to 5,000 parts per million. Because of this 11% increase, plant life has increased by the size of the United States of America. Productivity of plants is up 27%, and plants are now less prone to drought. And these green areas have often been in places that were once desert. This means that we're now able to produce food in these areas where food is needed. Now, all farmers know that you have to inject CO2 into greenhouses. Now, they inject CO2 to a level of 1,000 parts per million. Now, is 1,000 parts per million dangerous to human life? Just go and ask a submariner who has to live in an environment of 8,000 parts per million. Now, he suffers no ill effect. Have you ever wondered why the plants that you see in the garden centres are all lush and green and doing really well until you get them home? Yeah, that's because the farmers that grow these plants and flowers and vegetables and whatever have injected CO2 into their environment, and when you get them home, there isn't the CO2 anymore. Now, we're told to stop making more CO2, and then there is other net zero rhetoric that's going around. Yet every single molecule of man-made CO2, there is another 85,000 parts of other CO2. And the UK is responsible for 1% of all the man-made CO2 in the atmosphere. So, by my calculations, the UK has produced one molecule of CO2 for every 850,000 molecules of CO2. And yet we're expected to pay for that. It's costing the taxpayer a fortune to reduce our output. And do we really think that by giving the government money, they can control the planet's climate? I don't think so. Anyway, as for wind power and solar power, they're not quite as green as we make out they are. Actually, wind farms actually produce more CO2 than they save. And wind farms are also made out of balsa wood. So we've cut down swathes of forest to make our solar panel, the wind farm blades. And they're also made out of epoxy resins and glues, which are toxic to the environment. So at the end of their life, they end up in landfill, and the toxins will leak back into the soil and damage our planet. And you can imagine my embarrassment and surprise when I read about solar panels, because I've got solar panels up there, and I feel that I've been lied to. Anyway, every single climate prediction has failed. But if you don't believe in the next climate crisis prediction, then you're a flat earther. And incidentally, the earth was proved round by people who follow the data. The earth has never been proven flat by people who just believe it is flat. So that's something else to think about. But every single climate prediction has failed. From ice ages to the end of oil, to global warming, to sea rise levels, to seawater level increases. Even Greta Thunberg had to delete her tweet saying that humanity was going to end on June 21st, 2023. Well, that never happened. Now we've got Sadiq Khan and his doomsday clock. And yesterday I read somewhere that Just Oil is claiming that humanity will be gone by 2026. But the bottom line is that there is no money to be had in denying climate crisis. But for the climate alarmist, there is a fortune to be made. Wind farms, solar panels, storage for solar farms and wind power, energy, batteries for EV, cars. We all know that third world labour goes into mining the minerals and metals for these EV batteries. And that CO2 that's produced by those people isn't counted either. And then there are other energy saving devices, all made by China. Now, China doesn't have the best worker safety record in history, does it? Well, I'm coming to the end. As I've said before, it's easier to con someone than to prove that they have been conned. Now, I firmly believe that climate change is the biggest con of our time. But I guess I'm just a silly flat earther and a climate denier. Yeah. Anyway, so go and have a little look at those scientists in the description, and I watched most of their videos and read some of their papers whilst on my camping holiday in the coldest July on record. Well, almost. Anyway, it was certainly a lot cooler than June, but then again, we didn't have any rain in June, and we didn't have any sunny days in July. So anyway, I digress. Anyway, I'm going to go and download this and get it up and see where it takes us. Okay, bye then.